advocate the good for the South African people represented by the government, right? And in turn, this someone can then become involved in the provision of the public goods through institutions and governance. If we assume that SAI, it's a big assumption, should be managed as a public good for guaranteeing the public interest, another term that is used by Renner and his co-authors, it requires that such a public interest is clearly identified, especially the public qualifier there. So 2 questions, 1 remark. Is there a collective, at least in the making, for handling SAI as a public good? If not, could there be such a collective? If so, under which forms and conditions? I know that I'm throwing a lot to the discussion there. If you ask my opinion, maybe you don't care, I will give it anyway. So I'm a little bit pessimistic toward the existence of such collective. I think the emergence of such collective faces strong contrary winds, so geopolitical tensions, lack of public familiarity with SRM, misinformation from pseudo-experts that propagate all sorts of crazy ideas about SRM, but on the contrary, distrust toward established experts and institutions. Thank you very much for your attention. 1 minute over time. Just one.
Thank you very much, Xavier. That was a very thought-provoking presentation. He said he was going to bring in the theoretical aspects of this discussion, and it's been quite thought-provoking. He's asking us questions that I'm sure after the presentations we are going to throw it back to him, his very presentation, whether he still sees SAI as a public good. Considering that even though talking about climate, we don't see the impacts same across regions, yet we are also talking about the fact that it should be large scale if you are talking about public good. I'm already putting your mind to some of the questions you should already start expecting to hear. So without wasting much time, we will move to the second presentation for this afternoon. A moment, please. So governance is really up and coming, and we are looking forward to more of it. So next to present is a postdoctoral researcher who is going to talk about the legitimacy of this discussion. Over to you, Bennett.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm Bennett Francis. I'm a researcher based at the University of Twente in the Netherlands, and I'm also a political philosopher by training, so apologies if that isn't your cup of tea, but this is a paper which does approach the topic from that perspective, and that topic is legitimacy in relation to SRM research. I should say I'm a member of this project Co-Create, which I encourage you all to Google. And that said, what I'm about to say isn't necessarily the institutional view of the project. Also, this is a piece which is co-authored with my colleague Dominic Lency, so please attribute any faults in this presentation to me rather than him. So this is a paper which grows out of a review which was conducted under Co-Create, reviewing on the one hand the recent series of high-level research policy reports from institutions in the US, the EU, and international institutions on the one hand, and ethics literature relevant to the question of research governance on the other. And I guess the broad framing we could say that the broad framing was that the US National Academy's report represented a major contribution to the question of research governance, and then just before Christmas, we had a series of reports from the European Unions. I'm just giving a sort of introduction, which we'll hear more about, I think, with Sven's talk, which kind of can be viewed as representing European science policy's response to that, to the US context. So we wanted to build on that European context, but this particular contribution is at quite a high level, so it's not necessarily only relevant to European context. It can have wider relevance. So I'm going to just briefly talk about how legitimacy is discussed in these authoritative reports. I'm going to talk about a conception of legitimacy arising from some key ethics literature. I'm going to defend a picture of institutional legitimacy on that basis, and then I think a response to objections will be left for the Q&A. In NASM, we've got this call for transdisciplinarity and research governance structures that build trust and legitimacy. In the European Group on Ethics, which was an advisory body which fed into the Europe's Group of Chief Scientific Advisors, we saw public participation in research being linked to legitimacy of any future SRM intervention, so linking legitimacy in research to legitimacy in deployment. And in the evidence review under the scientific advice mechanism, we saw a suggestion that concerns for procedural justice and legitimacy could be means to address concerns about things like elite capture. And we also saw legitimacy described as one of three main categories of ethical concern in relation to SRM research as well as deployment. Given this continued prominence for legitimacy in the variety of contexts in which it's invoked, we wanted to just get clear on what legitimacy attribution requires in these contexts, and we wanted to defend a particular view on that, not necessarily to the exclusion of other conceptions of legitimacy, but just to call for it not to get lost in the debate. So in ethics literature, legitimacy is often understood under a normative rather than descriptive conception, meaning it's about whether the object of assessment conforms to certain norms or standards rather than being about the extent to which it's actually regarded as having the right to act as it does by the people it affects. It's often understood as a property of institutions rather than, for example, particular interventions. And there's also debate regarding the functional role of legitimacy assessments, which we don't have time to go into in this paper, but we adopt one view within that debate, which Alan Buchanan has called the meta-coordination view. I'll say what I mean by that just in a moment, but to suffice it to say for now that we want to bring out the fact that legitimacy assessment has a normative function beyond just the function of minimizing the likelihood of public backlash. By meta-coordination view, I mean the idea that to say an institution is legitimate is to say that it's worthy of our support on the basis of moral reasons, because the benefits of empowering it via that support outweigh the risks of doing so, and because the function of institutions is to coordinate collective action, the practice of legitimacy assessment addresses a meta-coordination problem by promoting institutional architectures that are conducive to the resolution of coordination problems. So this has two upshots. First, it means that the scope of legitimacy criteria are defined by the scope of the collective action problem institutions are supposed to be addressing, and also the interpretation of legitimacy criteria are determined by the context in which that institution operates. So we discuss a couple of existing accounts of normative institutional legitimacy in the ethics literature. There are a couple of things we think that they get right, but a couple of points on which their accounts are under-theorized, I think, is firstly that they don't really distinguish between potential categories of intervention. They are rather than looking at the institutional architecture as it actually is, they talk about a potential hypothetical institution. They write as though all potential functions that an institution for overseeing SRM might serve have to be vested in a single institution rather than potentially split into a whole cluster of institutions with separate legitimacy conditions. So these are the conditions that they come up with. We want to focus on a couple of them, and they suggest that in the context of SRM research institutions, these criteria may or must involve stakeholder participation, but the scope and justification for participation, again, is under-theorized. So what we want to do is put a little bit more theoretical flesh on those bones. So recall that the meta-coordination view defines the scope of legitimacy conditions by the scope of collective action problems that institutions are supposed to solve. Institutions directing SRM research in the context of something like the EU research architecture are doing so in the context of a wider research program addressing climate action. So effectively then, international climate action is the collective action problem to be assessed by the relevant research policy institutions for the purposes of legitimacy assessment. Second, recall that the specific interpretation of legitimacy criteria is to be determined by the institutional context. So here, determining that an institution represents a clear benefit and is thus potentially legitimate involves meeting standards established in the context of international climate action. So we argue that this involves ensuring the globally vulnerable to climate change are given voice and are empowered to participate in decision-making on terms of parity. This is the conception of justice termed recognition. So here we appeal to a combination of arguments on the basis of public attitude studies on the one hand, and to arguments on the basis of international practice on the other. In particular, the idea of the right to participate in decision-making on environmental matters. Providing benefit also involves preventing breakdowns in international coordination through conflict. So the thought here is that without strong forms of international participatory oversight, international power imbalances based in information and so international power imbalances that may potentially arise from imbalances in information and imbalances in competences arising from research will constitute an effective breakdown in coordinated climate action. So for this reason, stakeholder participation in decision-making on SRM research policy serves the function of mitigating potential for domination. Coming to a close then, I just wanted to note that all this serves to reinforce the principle which was proposed by the AGU under their ethics framework for climate intervention research, namely that the decision to pursue research and thus decision-making on research policy should be subject to stakeholder participation requirements, and it is at this level of decision-making on research policy rather than at the level of particular research projects that we're proposing that legitimacy assessment ought to be conducted and legitimacy criteria ought to be met. So I am actually under time, but I think if I do the next bit, I'll be over time. So I will leave it at that for now, and thank you very much for your attention.
So we left the practical aspect to the last presentation. So to do that is Sven Schade from EU. Let me leave it the EU Commission. He is going to introduce himself when he takes the floor, but he's going to talk us through some practical perspectives from all we've heard this afternoon. Over to you.
Thanks. Well, normally one is very happy if one gets a bridge into the own topic, and Bennett built one. Also, I feel it's not a bridge, but it's a ladder to climb down from the academic excellence on considerations to the modern world of policy making. Bennett mentioned authoritative reports by the EU, and here my purpose today is basically to explain to show you what these three reports by our science policy interface mean, and that they are not expressions of an EU position, but they are recommendations by the science community, by the ethical community to the EU. And I want to show you how we are working with that. I have a task description in the EU Commission DG Research and Innovation to look for better ways to do research for the green transition. I'm not a specialist in SRM. I am not a specialist in SAI. I'm more a generalist on the things, and exactly in that point of interface between theoretical consideration, ethical considerations, practical considerations, how to fund projects for one of the largest, or perhaps the largest single research program in the world, Horizon Europe, with a budget of 100 billion over 7 years. So we have a critical mass of things to fund, a critical mass of ideas, but we have to look for impact. We have to look for what shall we do, where do we create harm with what we fund, and how do we use the funding in the best public interest. Our starting point of the work here was a quote which is very often overseen in the IPPC Working Group 2 6 assessment report, which says the co-evolution of governance and SRM research provides the co-evolution of governance and SRM research provides a chance for responsibly developing technologies. That means, they further on write, the research is thinking about the governance of research is probably the only way to arrive to a governance of deployment later. One cannot develop all the technology and then come up with, oh, no, I'm thinking about governance of deployment. Internally, in the political discussions, many policymakers would shy away to put to put SRM technologies in the field of climate policy as a climate policy option, because then we are really in the slippery slope. Oh, it would undermine mitigation. But discussing it in the context of research policy might be a completely different thing, because who is interested, openly said, who is interested in the public in research policy? There are not many people. That's a rather small group, and everybody agrees we need more research to be done. So that was our starting point. Does the EU have an official position on SRM options? No. We don't have. We have one statement in a climate and security nexus communication where the EU officially says we consider that SRM technologies have a security dimension which needs to be considered in our policy making. So, and that is a critical one. Otherwise, regarding to climate policy, explicitly we have never taken a position about SRM. That's still in the making. However, indirectly, the EU is a treaty partner to the Biodiversity Convention, and it's supported in the interpretation of this de facto moratorium from the CBD. It has the practice of speaking on international fora with one voice among the EU and its member states. So that complicates the situation a little bit. So you have to see here the discussion that if we are in the international domain, getting 27 plus 1 agreed on a statement is very difficult. That hinders. But in the practical implementation, we then align. And Pascal Lamy yesterday gave an introduction about the EU in general. In the different domains, we have very different competencies. So if we leave the area of international climate treaty or international treaties, then in the area of research policy, we have much more autonomy. Yeah, so what we do, what we develop for research policy, can then give an example to the member state, to our member states, to basically work with us or to copy us. So here we can take an advancement without them all agreeing. That's another one, another element in this discussion why research policy is for us. The governance of research of SRM could be an interesting field to move ahead. How did we move ahead? We have an EU scientific advisory service. This advisory service is managed by us in the Research General Directorate on behalf of the Commission. Only the other policy directorates can basically mobilize this, and here we have from 2013 a scoping paper from Vice President Timmermans at the time. What do we want to know about SRM? Here you read the statements, the most important one. We would like to ask our scientific advisory mechanism how to address the risk and opportunities associated with research on SRM, and its potential deployment. And what are the options for governance system for research and potential deployment, taking into account different SRM technologies and their scale? Here, these questions were put on the table, and our advisory mechanism looks graphically like that. The request for advice, we have a group of chief scientific advisors, 5 or 6, which are selecting the bureau. We have the Association of Academies of Science. Jackie Cado would have been the counterpart for that in Africa. The Association of Academies of Science, they select basically a group of experts among them. And we have an ethics group which brings in specifically the ethics dimension. They are a little bit separate. The SAPEA wrote a technical report about what is the state of knowledge, and that ranges from the technology, from the problem, down to the international treaty aspect, so where might SRM be covered, where not. They don't make recommendations. The recommendations came from the ethics groups, purely on ethics, and from the group of chief scientific advisors. Yeah. They basically took then the SAPEA report and the ethics group and said, hey, we would recommend you as chief scientific advisors to work in this way, to formulate policies in this way. Quickly, what do the reports say? SAPEA, fundamental issues, you can read it here. Policy options for SRM research are listed. Abstain from doing any research. Fund, possibly limited to indoor, with the aim to establish research governance standards. So we can also fund in order to establish standards in research. Negotiate research agreements with other countries. That can also if you have nothing at hand and you want money on the table, you cannot negotiate that. But if you do, define limitations would be another approach, another option. Care about transparency and access to information. That's something they highlight as absolutely essential in the form of repositories or whatever. A work on limiting IP protection could be an element of research policy related to SRM, and establish a periodical report system. They are here just listing the options. Strong wording, in one case, a ban on process-oriented field experiment would hamper understanding of aerosol and cloud processes. So here they also a statement with a little bit of a recommendation, hey, ban process-oriented research might not be the most helpful option to pursue. But they did not give the advice, not the recommendation. The European Group on Ethics, the baseline areas, priority has to be emission reduction and carbon removal, and the change and working on the change of social and economic practices in our societies. The SRM shall not become a business opportunity out of democratic control for ethical considerations. The legitimacy of SRM is based on an informed civil participation with representation of interests of future generations and non-human entities. That should be considered as well. We should prevent an epistemic and political dominance of more influential countries or groups that are historically responsible for the problem. A clear no to a utility-based argumentation. And said why? Because they say the utility functions are impossible to establish in a fair manner. But also a no to a strict interpretation of the precautionary principle. Yeah, so they said we have 27 definitions of precautionary principles, so it was very difficult to find here, or don't work on a strict precautionary principle. What do they recommend now? Now we are in the field of recommendations, as I said. An obligation to share results openly. Whatever is done, the research results should be openly accessible. They recommend a precautionary approach, which they further on define, and combined with adaptive and reflexive governance mechanisms. So don't make a decision now, but develop your governance as the knowledge develops and be flexible in it. Acknowledge complexity from the very beginning in order to become adaptive. If you say it's a simple problem, I find a simple solution. No, that's not the case. They take the kind of post-normative science, and then it's probably in your field than in mine of theory. Focus on the quality of research, enhance legitimacy and trust, and ultimately they recommend from the ethical perspective a EU moratorium on large-scale experiments and use supported on large-scale experiment and use. So moratorium on large-scale experiment and use, supported by a proposal for an international treaty. So the EU should move, their recommendation from ethical point of view, the EU should move ahead with a moratorium on use and large-scale experiment, and at the same time make that as a proposal for an international treaty. And then there are many proposals regarding soft law, participation, participatory, in a moment.
Just a clarification. Utility-based argumentations and utility functions, can you just explain what those are?
The maximization of the benefit for the most as a justification for political, for a policy. They say, no, this doesn't work because you cannot define the function, the utility function and the negative functions. So the optimization is not possible. Lately, what do the chief scientific advisors make out of that, and what they do they recommend to us? Again, priority has to be emission reduction and adaptation to minimize overshoot. An EU-wide moratorium on the use of SRM to offset warming. Negotiating a global government system for deployment. Starting point, clearly a non-deployment that we had before in the ethical part, yes, so not. It shall include a mechanism for authorization of outdoor research. Yeah, I'm done in a moment. Set ethical requirements for SRM research, ethics boards, etc. That is more a recommendation to us. And reassess evidence every 5 to 10 years in order to have this flexibility mechanism. What will we do with that? Of our 27 member states, more than half have less than 10 million inhabitants. So they have very small communities that discuss. They often are not able to express opinions, and we see a big capacity gap for example, at the UNEA conference. So using these reports, which are all in the public domain, you can use them in your countries as well, for capacity building activities with the member states in order to inform a position, which is then becomes a joint position. The interesting part in our research program are not only the 27 countries, but 15 other countries, ranging from Egypt and Tunisia to Armenia to Canada and South Korea. So there would also be a group which can discuss about how do we do research related to the funding, and then defining European and wider actions to be financed from our budget in future, and in the spirit of the recommendations of the IPCC, define some actions that we might bring together forward with interested countries regarding, for example, defensive instruments. So nobody should have something against the monitoring system, against Rouge deployment. Thanks a lot. Sorry that was so down to earth.
I think our presenters need another round of applause. Thank you so much. How's the feeling in the room, if I may ask? Before we even start asking questions, let them just warm up and have their seats and prepare for us. But I want to have a feel. How do you feel after listening to them? Cold?
Cold.
Can you explain the cold to us?
It's the temperature.
Oh, the temperature of the room. All right. Let's getting a bit into our brains and on the topic for the session. Overwhelming. I like that. Any more? Go ahead. Maybe this side of the room. How is it feeling? Great. Intrigued. I like that. You are challenged. All right. Any more? At least we need to hear from everyone before we leave. So, yes. How do you feel?
No, it's not a question, but from the presentation, the chief scientific advisors, what they did advise on the issue of, what is this? Sorry. That you are not really in for SRM. That has also touched me, and I think we need to think twice as stakeholders, as the different blocks, Africa, Asia, the different blocks. Can we think twice about this? Thank you.
Sorry that I missed part of the presentations. I was coughing. I'd rather cough outside than worry you all. I'm not contagious. I just wanted to continue what Honourable Margaret has said. If the EU generally does not support the SRM, and then what we have noticed as observers for the other big group who might be able to support Africa is America. And if America, as we have learned, is not really pro-environmental, they're not environmentalists right now, where does that leave Africa? Where does that leave us? is China or India also is country in transition, sort of. Where does that leave Africa? So if we are to embrace this new form of, they don't say it's mitigation, but to me I think it's mitigation. I'm ready to fight. I'm a lawyer. I love to fight. So they don't say it's mitigation, but to me I think it's mitigation. Where does that leave us? And how do we advise the governments? If you're saying, if EU is saying, EU, you have the resources to do the research, and America also has the resources to do the research. And I have met very passionate environmentalists who are American, but their government, as I know, as we all know and we've seen, is not pro-environmental. Where does that leave Africans? And what are we supposed to tell the African governments if we're saying, you know, we've got our own issues. Our own issues are competing priorities. So this is a public good, as we have learned from Xavier. Okay? Just a minute, I still have the... Thank you.
Sorry, I have to...
I think our speaker was very clear that it's not really an EU position, but it was from experts to the EU, if I heard correctly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. This is a recommendation of the science sector, of ethics sector. The academies of science have a quote where you may laugh. We had heated debates because one part of the group wanted to forbid the research that the other part was undertaking. Yeah? So it's a recommendation to us as policymakers to work on, to work with. What the outcome is, and that is, could be something completely different. Yeah?
Yeah, I have to do my mea culpa. I should whip myself in public because I did a sloppy job as a philosopher there. I consider that research and deployment were collectively considered by my remark on public good. I should have distinguished the research side from the deployment, and research probably fit maybe better the definition of a public good than research plus deployment. Sorry for that. I didn't contribute to clarity of the debate here.
Just answer the only question I had for you, because I really wanted that clarification.
Well,
all right. So
yeah, first, thanks to the speakers for some great talks there. I guess the focus there was a lot on how to make solar geoengineering research legitimate. But I guess I want to turn that round and ask, would climate research in Europe or elsewhere be legitimate if it did not include some consideration of solar geoengineering?
Yeah.
Look, being very practical, we have an alliance of 1,500 non-governmental organizations which stand as a wall against any type of SRM-related activity, including research. For every politician, it would be, and that's the reason why in some countries really nothing moves. Yeah? For every politician, it would be nightmarish to stick the head out and say, I want to do. Yeah? So, yes, you can have a policy and say, I do climate research without SRM. You could have a policy. Whether it's wise is a different question. And Selma Krug yesterday, I think, did it exactly and mirrors what the output here is. We don't want to use it. We don't, but we might be in a situation where we need it, and we cannot deprive the future generations from the option, and therefore we have to develop it. Yeah? And I think the three reports are very intelligent in framing that and coming from different sides.
When you say develop it, what do you mean? Develop the research or the actual implementation?
The only criticism we had, even from the most critical NGOs, was, oh my God, the EU is considering large-scale experimentation. Yeah, so that is politically a very good outcome. If the most critical NGO only criticized that.
All right. Can you find it first? Oh, you wanted to? Yeah, sure.
Because it was on legitimacy, I think my approach to that question would be to say that when we're thinking of normative legitimacy in particular, we're providing a kind of a parameter for reasoning about whether certain kinds of activities are justified. So in a context when certain activity is kind of taken as a given, legitimacy assessment is less relevant, whereas in a context when you're introducing potentially new area of development, then it's for that reason that legitimacy assessment becomes relevant. And so that would be a reason there for this potential kind of apparent asymmetry between the case of climate research in general and its legitimation, and SRM research in particular and its legitimation.
Yeah, can I add something? Yeah, the question of Peter understood it that it's the kind of social expectations that society has towards scientists, that they cover all the options, at least to give to the policymakers a kind of an overview. And if they don't cover SRM, there is something that they are not totally performing their work. But a quick comment on that, it seems that it's representative of a gridlock that we have also for early governance, the fifth principle of the Oxford Principles. We should have development of research along development of its governance, but no one wants to open the governance of geoengineering. Why? Because it's a Pandora box, and you have the feeling that you open the box and things will start to take out, and you will have deployment in all parts of Europe. And there seems to be a gridlock, the same thing like with covering SRM from scientists. I'm not a scientist, but I can imagine the pressure that scientific teams have to not include SRM in their research project.
Points very well noted, so I give you the floor.
Sure. Thanks for the three very stimulating talks. One question for Xavier, one question for Sven. Xavier, the question that I'm going to ask has nothing to do with your conclusions, which I think are, on the whole, I can sort of agree with. But really, it's the fundamental question, I think, for everyone who takes up this issue and starts with the Oxford Principles. Do you think that Steve Rayner really was starting with the notion of public goods as it's identified in the formal economic literature? Great. I agree. Thank you. And I wasn't sort of saying it's great because I agree. It's like, great, you're making me feel better about how I feel about it. So you're providing, yeah, but it's interesting. It's because it's a debate that everyone who starts with that has. Cool. So Sven, going to your position 3 over there, the next step will be going to co-creation of joint positions, just because I'm less familiar about, what can and cannot be done as that gets pursued. So just to give you a hypothetical, Pascal was talking last night, I'm not sure if you heard in the plenary, about this attempt to form a club of countries, a coalition of the willing, not starting with let's look at the Framework Convention or the CBD or something else or UNEA. I understand the motivation by your folks to sort of point in that direction. But as a preliminary step that could or could not help with that effort, is there anything that would stop individual European states from joining such a coalition?
No.
Okay.
There would not be. Sorry, Mike is gone. No, it would not. We are. And the advantage that we see is in the field of research policy. Yeah? If we would find agreement on the way, on the limits, on the demands of how we fund research. Yeah, that ARIA is at the moment putting up 60 million on the table, while we have these 3 reports in the domain, yeah, and not having discussed it is a little bit unfortunate. Yeah, but okay, they are not member of the EU, unfortunately.
The question would relate to the role of research in the social sciences, because often I feel that when there is discussion about research, it's mostly about the natural sciences. So Sven, I would be interested to see how you saw the role of the social sciences in the 3 reports and whether they actually did contribute to, for example, resolving your third question, what policies specifically should be undertaken. Thank you.
I can reassure you the social sciences and humanities were very, very important in that area. And if you read the reports, you see that basically the technological aspect is a rather limited one. And they really cared about the governance issues, the legitimacy, the different ethical approaches, etc. So it's a great piece of work when it comes to that.
My question's about the EU. You mentioned the recommendations are made to the Commission. So what's the Commission doing with these recommendations now, especially the recommendation regarding a moratorium? Are they considering, studying, reviewing? What's the current state of affairs in that regard?
And that's the discussion we are currently having, and I'm reporting back and investigating here the landscape. Yeah? So in intelligence in that respect, and report back and see how far, what would we make out of it. The moratorium is something we see popping up very, very often, and probably I would be completely aligned with what Thelma Krug yesterday said. And I've written it back in this way and say, hey, look, there are people who are expressing exactly what we have in our reports. So the communities might use different terms, have different approaches. Personally, really personal opinion from me, I see a lot of convergence in the discussion. And I think one of the speakers yesterday had it also.
Follow up, convergence around the idea of a moratorium.
Yes. Yeah. Well, a moratorium on deployment while developing the options.
Actually, if I may follow up on that wording, what I find curious about how SRM is often discussed is this sort of fudging of the boundary between doing research for the purposes of knowing more, exploring the different dimensions, risks, possibilities, potential for good and for bad, versus the notion of developing, which is very much directional toward having a capability in place to deploy one day, if it is so desired. And I'm wondering, and this is part of the premise, part of the Co-Create project as well, part of the premise of a session here, can we draw a line between those, and can this be operationalized in research policy? And if so, then perhaps we can step away from this idea that research predetermines the future, where actually the opposite should be true, that it actually opens up possibilities both to prevent the use, if it turns out to be a bad idea, and to potentially use it if it turns out to be the less bad of two possibilities. So I'd like to explore that a bit more, perhaps if you have any thoughts.
That was a question to the audience, not to me. Huh?
But you can share some perspectives if you.
I find the combination of the EGE report, the European Group on Ethics, yeah, and the chief scientific advisors very interesting. The international moratorium starting from non-deployment, and a reflexive, adaptive, post-normative science approach. Yeah, that an agreement to review periodically the moratorium. I find that something really interesting. Yeah, because it breaks this logic of that the research leads to deployment.
Yeah. Xavier, you want to share something?
This is sort of half a question for you and half an observation that I think is also interesting. In the Group of Chief Scientific Advisors report, you've got this formulation, which is that there should be a moratorium and the negotiation of an international permitting system. Is that, if I remember correctly? But the report seems to be sort of quiet on what the position on experimentation prior to the negotiation of an international agreement would be, which you might imagine would be quite far off. So I don't know if that one way of interpreting that is that it makes room for the kind of space and the line that Matthias was alluding to, or it might be that there is a more fixed position behind that, which Sven could speak to. I don't know.
Yeah, just to add something about what Matthias, the comment of Matthias, it's something that is often not very well identified outside the research community, is that there is two ways that's true to deal with research. One is research driven by curiosity. That's not my wording, I don't remember from where it is, and there is the mission-driven, I think McMartin was. So your question was about that, so there are two ways to concept research. One is to try to answer questions, generally speaking, about models, and the other is to have a more like a mandate, or try to figure out specific question. And there it's probably, I don't know anything about regulation, European regulation, so I will not venture in that territory, but we are probably losing a lot of time by not making this distinction, because, for instance, if we adopt a mission-driven research, we can start to think about harm reduction. So like comparable to what's happening, has been happening with drug users in Canada or Switzerland, where you try to reduce the harm that their activities have. We could do the same with SRM, trying to figure out, using, for instance, as you did, Matthias, with the SDGs, and trying to figure out, okay, what are the kind of the impact on various dimensions, and try to minimize or to protect vulnerable population, and having a research project that is designed to deliver that, or at least to reply to some questions that policymakers have. But it seems that, especially outside the community, again, we are trapped in that. The research means answering the big question about stratospheric aerosol injection, or I don't know, climate modeling.
Any more? Anyone who wants to take in before I end? Yeah.
I'm interested in the process. Yeah, in the process of putting all the researchers together, like, because I think we are in the same, well, we're a bit behind in the ASEAN, but there's a desire to come up with a regional insight. As of now, we're still, the position is still based on the COP 10-33, which was more than 10 years ago. And so but there are already ongoing researches that are happening on a small scale. But I think all of this should be able to feed into a regional policy. And so I'm interested on how this was done in the EU, whether it was prodded by the policymakers, were you asked to do this for them, or was it an initiative by the researchers to come together and come up with a recommendation that will guide future policies on a regional scale? So, and also, I forgot, there was another question I think on the moratorium, because there's a lot of there's still a lot of uncertainties on the technology on SRM, and there's a lot of fear on deployment, and that's the rationale behind the decision in the CBD. But of course, it opened some opportunities for small scale and controlled environment. So, and I think, at least for ASEAN, for the culture, it's skeptical. It's more precaution. The idea is not really, if you present the research as towards deployment, then immediately, there will be some apprehensions on having it introduced. So I think it should also be strategic on how, why would you research? Is it for deployment, or is it for regulation, or is it for the countries to be able to manage the gradual or manage the technology because it's already there, it's already around. So that's my second question. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that would be the last from the floor. So any reactions?
I had on the process, I had it on one of the slides. Yeah, so it is a standing mechanism. These three: Association of European Academies of Science, Chief Scientific Advisors, and the European Group on Ethics. They are currently working on advanced AI, yeah, on the same question with a similar terms of reference, yeah, with similar questions to respond to, and synthetic biology. Yeah, so it's something we have in place, and which was mobilized by the policy, by the climate policy community inside the Commission. Please, scientific advisors, tell us more about SRM and ethics about SRM, etc. So that's an advantage if you have a big group, and the use context, we have an own research program. So what we don't have to put it out and say, hey, this is the, but it can be our very modest, what is ethical behavior of an SRM researcher? Yeah, of an aerosol researcher. Shall an aerosol researcher show that they are in the application, that they are working for cloud interaction from climate modeling, or that the application domain would be SRM and that the knowledge he or she is producing would be relevant to formulate, yeah, to develop SRM technology? We can ask for it, we can ask for a reflection, we can ask for harm. What do you consider about potential harm? So we have some instrument to squeeze the researchers, and there we are evidently in a privileged position, yeah, to be on the one hand policy maker and implementer at the same time.
All right. All right. Yeah. Thank you all so much. I think, again, I would say it's been a thought-provoking session, but it's been very insightful. And even coming from a developing country point of view, or from the Global South, it's clearly, for me, the take-home is that even the research around SRM cannot happen in vacuum. And that it's about time, even in our own conversations, we start thinking about who actually says yes and no. In terms of even the research, not to talk about the deployment. We are nowhere near that. And even with the research, we have a lot to really think about. So thank you so much, our dear speakers. I think we have learned a lot from you this afternoon, and it's been great having you. And thank you all so much for making the session very interesting and engaging very well with our speakers. And let's keep moving SRM governance forward and the conversation going on. Thank you.